Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Zero HP Lovecraft. Zero, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
It's very good to have you. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about what we're going to get into today, in particular because you're unlike some of my other guests in that I think you are the first Agora Politics guest who is totally anonymous. And so congrats to you. One of my goals for the show, actually, starting back when I interviewed Josh Schollenberger, I believe in March, was to start having more Anons on the show. And part of the reason why I want to have more anonymous personalities on the show was because there are certain things that they are allowed to say or that they're willing to say that individuals acting under their own identity will not or cannot in certain cases. And so it's always interesting to me the dynamics between sort of the anons and the non-anons that happens on Twitter. I actually the other week I hosted a conversation on Clubhouse that was about pseudonymity and varying shades of identity exposure that you can have on the internet. That was a quite an interesting conversation as well. We actually managed to get at least one sort of cybersecurity expert who talked a little bit about the varying degrees of interconnectedness with your actual identity that you could sort of leave online, whether you want to be whether you wanted to go by your identity or pseudonymously or anonymously. Those are sort of three varying levels of security control. So how do you think about the choice to, not only write under a pen name, but also to, maintain this sort of online anonymous persona?
Well, there are a few considerations. The first is that there really is no such thing as true anonymity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, whether you talk about my phone, my computer, my browser, yeah, I use a VPN, but it doesn't matter. Like, if there are people in this world who, if they wanted that information, if they wanted to unmask me, they absolutely could. And that's true no matter who you are and what you do, though you can make it easier or harder. So I try to do everything I can to have what we call operational security. But I mean, ultimately, we're all sort of at the mercy of the people who own the pipes, the people who own the technology, Apple, Google, and people like that.
Yeah.
So, still, yeah, try to make it as hard as I can for them.
Well, I was going to say, I was sending out messages yesterday, and Twitter actually made me go ahead and finally verify my my phone number with them for my main account. And so I was like, dang, okay, guys, you're getting real serious about this. And the notification I got was that if you want to send messages to accounts that you don't follow, you need to verify your phone number. And of course, they already know all of my other accounts because I'm not going out of my way to sort of, compartmentalize those, at the level of physical devices or anything like that. But I did think it was interesting that they're sort of trying to, I do worry that ultimately they're going to close the gates on all of this stuff and really force everyone to at least identify who they are totally on the back end, if not outright in public.
Yeah, a lot of us do use burner phones, purchase cash for those who are really paranoid, and you can do varying degrees of obfuscation around that, but still, like, ultimately, people can find you. I think that what will happen, has already happened, is something called social cooling. You may have heard this term. It's the idea that even without any kind of explicit rules about what you can and can't say, people are just increasingly fearful about talking around certain topics and sharing their honest opinions. Even if those opinions aren't harmful to anyone, we all just know certain things you can and can't say. And so what happens is the temperature of conversation just cools down. and we all sort of retreat into banal platitudes and pleasantries. We say exactly what we're allowed to say, and we don't venture off the reservation. That's what happens. And the more identity is tied to what you say online, the more that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is a peer-to-peer mechanism that's in place, right? That's causing a kind of self-censorship on a massive scale. And I think it's slightly different depending on your national context. You know, there's certain things Americans are going to be more uncomfortable about than non-Americans. But of course, one of the problems with our sort of the monoculture globalization that's happening across the internet, and it's particularly across the Anglosphere, is that increasingly the topics that are taboo or that the things that can't be said in an American context are sort of leaking out into other parts of the world, and essentially among a certain class of people, they're all sort of aligning along the same kind of moralistic values.
Right. The borders of the internet are much more porous than national borders or geographic borders. So it's really hard, unless like China has closed off their internet, for example, more or less, you can still break through, but it's harder. And sometimes I wonder, people have talked about, will we see every country, to the degree it's capable, sort of like walling off the internet? Could the internet ever have borders the way countries do? It's possible.
Well, I think it probably will eventually, because there's too much of an asymmetric advantage if, for example, you're a country like China who has the ability to uh, operate as a state inside of everyone else's internet, but doesn't allow the other way around, right? So, we've got like TikTok here in the United States, and there's no way that they would allow, I mean, they haven't allowed Facebook or Twitter or something like that to be openly operating in China, because of course they know what kind of influence you can carry, what kind of favors you can ask, even with a more, I'd say, light touch of government influence on these platforms here in the United States. You don't want the weapons of your enemy to just be sort of growing and gaining power inside your own country.
Indeed. And I saw just today that China had banned, maybe it was yesterday, China had banned some kind of, it wasn't OnlyFans, I think that was already banned, but it was Twitch, whatever it was, increasingly cut off these types of avenues for their own people. Like, they understand the harm that some these things are doing to them, not just as a weapon of like destabilizing a state, but you think about like there's a very real way that Instagram and TikTok and Twitch are all kind of a sales funnel for OnlyFans, especially like, I mean, for young women. So you get these girls, when they're 13, 14 or whatever, they can make a TikTok, they start dancing and they get attention. And the attention economy of these types of services, Instagram the same way, it rewards women for posting a certain type of content. And as they get a little older, it very naturally, if they just follow the incentive gradient, they can end up on OnlyFans. And I think that in China, they sort of understand this, like the people in charge can see it, and they're willing to prioritize the health of their population over whatever other crass incentives like drive something like OnlyFans. But in the US, they're just not willing. There's no will to do this. There's no political power to do this. No one's ever going to ban girls from, young girls from streaming TikTok here. It's just not going to happen. They tried, actually.
Yeah.
They tried to ban TikTok, you
Mm-hmm.
remember.
Yeah, I mean, I have younger sisters who I don't know. I think they're somewhat limited by their parents, but they they're already on TikTok, right? And they starting on TikTok at 12 and 13 years old, and they're going to be using it and at least browsing it. They're on Instagram all through their teenage years, And if you think about the mentality in particular that a teenage girl has around the time that they're developing around that period, what they want is, they want attention from others. They want attention from their peers. They want attention also from the boys that they like, and they're getting like insane amounts of relatively low cost social approval if they can post on those platforms. And so you do have to wonder what exactly that's going to do to them long term, particularly the kids that are coming up now who are totally enmeshed in this stuff. When I was growing up, it was already starting to be a little bit of a problem. But I think Instagram came around when I was like in high school, and before that, there was like Facebook or whatever. But yeah, it's certainly you do have to wonder at some point like why there is no political will. Do you think it just has to do with sort of the de-Christianization of the West and sort of the secularization that we're unwilling to put up any kind of moral guardrails on this stuff? Because there is a kind of moralizing and various kinds of moral panics that occur right now, but they don't seem to be concerned at all with sexual libertinism, unless of course you're a heterosexual male trying to find a mate, and then you're a problem. But all other kinds of sexual display and sexual degeneracy, I'll say, are totally permitted, and in fact you're probably a bad person if you're trying to rein any of it in at all. How do you think that relates to sort of the secularization and the moral uh uh I don't want to say corruption, but the moral inversion that's been going on since sort of the decline of Christianity and the rise of pseudo religion, things like wokeness, et cetera, here in the United States? How do you think about those?
That's a bit of a landmine of a question, but I think one of there's a couple sort of dimensions to it. One is that we have been convinced, that is, our government has been convinced, and our courts and our legal system, that pornography is a form of free speech. So in the 70s, the 80s, there was a lot of talk about decency and obscenity and what it is that you can publish, what kind of material you can sell. And the pornographers, they all got through it by saying, look, this is free speech. The First Amendment protects pornography. And so there's a legal dimension to it where we're kind of just in a gridlock there. If you try to ban porn, the argument inevitably comes back like, well, just don't inflict your beliefs on others. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to watch it. And that sort of libertarian stance is something that still animates a lot of Americans, both on the left and the right. We really want to believe in individual liberty in this way. And I would say that there's a lot of problems with that stance. There's no such thing. No one truly is an island. There's no true individual liberty. What we do affects each other, even if it's just in a very marginal way. And I think that the argument for individual liberty has crumbled, but many people haven't quite figured that out yet. The other thing is there's not really anyone with the authority to ban these things at the state level. Like there's no politician who can do it. I guess there might be some bureaucrat somewhere deep in Washington, D.C. who could theoretically do it, but it's just not how the bureaucracy functions. If anyone were to do it, it would have to be someone inside of Apple, someone inside of Google. These people would have to collaborate with each other. And they're really bureaucrats too. They're just private bureaucrats. That's all. So it's like, who would you even go to? Let's say you wanted to ban it, like you personally, and you started a movement. Maybe you get a petition together. Who would you take that petition to? Is the president going to do it? Like, there's no one. There's no head. No one's driving.
Well, so there is a movement right now to sort of shut down these large scale tube sites like Pornhub and YouPorn and whatnot. There's at least one activist I know of on Twitter who has been going after them in a legal sense and trying to do this whole exposure campaign because of sort of the dark, really dark, seedy, things that are going on with some of these videos that are posted against people's consent, or in some cases even just straight up snuff films that get uploaded. And so again, there's this kind of like the way that it's being done now is sort of in a roundabout way by trying to sort of force the platforms themselves to take responsibility for the content that's on them, which might actually work, but I don't know exactly what all the legal issues are around that. It's just that interesting that it's being made on more of like privacy grounds and issues relating to consent and so forth, and not just the fact that like, oh, this is damaging to our people.
Right. They can't make that argument. That avenue has been closed off. So instead, they have to argue, oh, these girls are being, they're victims of human trafficking, which is undeniably true in some cases, or that they have to find other things to bust them on. It's the equivalent of going after a murderer or something like that and busting them on a marijuana charge.
Or when they
kind
got
of the to take
when they got Al Capone on tax evasion,
Right. But what will actually happen if these activists are successful, and they very likely could be, you do see some of them getting press in, major periodicals like The Atlantic or the New York Times or whatever. What would happen, it won't actually get the porn. Instead, you'll start to see some, more regulation come in, which will actually just entrench the big players, probably like, I don't know, Pornhub or whatever will be fine. They'll clamp down, they'll essentially use this regulation to discourage their smaller competitors. Not that I'm arguing that we need competition in the porn space, but that's what regulation like this always inevitably does, is it's not a strategy for curating the health of the populace. It's a strategy for destroying your competition in a market space. So you'll start to see porn that has like a seal that's like, this is ethically sourced porn, that kind of thing. It's like the equivalent of buying organic groceries.
Organic. That's an interesting parallel there. And I think they're going to do something similar with the platforms, other social platforms as well. As far as closing the door on misinformation or whatever they want to call it on Twitter, on YouTube, on all these places. Really what you're doing is, even if they put these kinds of tools in place, they're just going to be making it harder for upstarts to actually build out their own networks again, because now you have additional tools and additional responsibilities and legal issues that you have to account for, that you need capital for, in order to even get to even be in compliance. So anyway,
right.
I wanted to get to a little bit more about who you are and how you came into the online space. I know from hearing about your posts online, so I've been following you for a number of years, and I know from hearing about your other posts online that you were sort of a lurker in various online communities for a long time, and then at some point decided to create this persona and start putting your writing out under that name. What made you decide to sort of want to start building out an online persona? And did you know that you wanted to be anonymous from the beginning?
I always knew that I wanted anonymity. I never set out to be a character or a person in this space. I just, I found it interesting. Do you remember a really old website called grouphug.us?
No.
It was sort of a brief, it was a small social media network that was probably alive for less than a year. And you could only be anonymous. And you didn't have to make an account. You just went onto the site. There was a text box and you could write your anonymous confession, and people just upvote it and share it. And so people would just say what they wanted. They just did off their chest. And it could be, really, really mundane stuff. Like I took $1, from like that I shouldn't, like I stole someone's money, simple stuff, people confessing sexual infidelity, things that aren't even, some things that weren't even, bad at all. Just like I had an extra slice of ham on my sandwich, anything, it could be anything. And so to me, when I first made a Twitter account, there were some of these people I followed, people like Nick Land, or at the time, Bronze Age Pervert was not even a name. No one really knew who he was. I just, I made an anonymous account and I sort of treated it like grouphug.us. It was a confession box, an anonymous confession box. And so I just started saying really whatever I wanted, and didn't get any attention for it. I wasn't preaching. I wasn't speaking my truth, as they say. But I did like writing fiction. So I kind of toiled with no expectation of anyone reading my work at all. I just wrote a story because I wanted to write a story, because I thought it was interesting to me personally, because I was seeing all these things online and I wanted to incorporate them into some kind of a narrative. And that turned into the gig economy. And so I posted it there, I was at the gym. I remember this very clearly. I had worked on the story for about almost a year, sent it to a couple of my friends, who knew me, my name, my face, and everything. And they said, hey, this is really good, actually. And they were surprised. I was surprised that they thought it was good. I posted it to my 50 followers, made a tweet between sets. I don't know what I was doing, probably deadlift or something, and didn't think anything of it. And then suddenly, like that weekend, my phone just nonstop vibrating from the Twitter notifications. This was before they grouped them all together. So every single like, every retweet, every comment was like its own notification. And the phone just didn't, I had to put it on silent. And it was crazy. I'd never experienced anything like that before. Funny, because I had written about it in the story, never having experienced it. And suddenly I had thousands of followers in one weekend. And people were like, the story went viral. Eliezer Yudkowsky tweeted it with some disclaimer like, oh, even a neo-reactionary can write something good, but he's so horrible, that kind of thing.
Sure. So I remember reading The Gig Economy myself a while back. I don't know if I was reading it right when it came out or sometime afterwards, or what exactly the timeline there was, but I do remember reading it and it having an impression on me. For those who haven't read The Gig Economy, do you want to give the audience just a brief rundown on kind of the main ideas and theme in the story?
Yeah, so it's a story ultimately about the techno-capital singularity. And at the time that I wrote it, Bitcoin I started when Bitcoin was in its first really crazy bull market. And it went up to, what was it, like $19,000 a coin in January of 2017, before it took a dive. Ethereum peaked around, I want to say, like 1,700 per token. So all the altcoins and shitcoins were pumping, and everyone was just in this mind of like, wow, the machine is rising, the global system of capital is renewing itself. And at the time, except so a lot of people were talking about techno-capital and this kind of like right-wing Marxism. So I incorporated a lot of those ideas. And the basic idea of accelerationism is that capital functions like a machine, that it continuously reorganizes the world for the multiplication and propagation of itself, and that it will reorganize society and produce machines which are ultimately capable of playing the market and expanding it better than humans are. And accelerationism views this as relatively inevitable. So I was inspired by that kind of philosophy that I was seeing online. I was inspired by the guy who made Primer, I always forget his name, he had this brilliant script for a movie that was never made called Utopiary. And it's kind of about this interstellar paperclip maximizer. And that was really a source of inspiration to me as well, and Borges and all the usual stuff. So in the story, there is an emergent artificial intelligence living on some blockchain. It's not really specified what blockchain it is, that's computing itself publicly across the world in all of these exchanges of tokens, and that it starts giving people jobs to do little jobs to sort of grow out its sensory awareness of the world and to manipulate the course of human events. And then in the sort of ultimate reveal, we find out that this AI actually came from outer space, from some distant star, and wormed its way through history. It was part of, there's a tie into the Tower of Babel. It sounds very strange when I explain it this way, but it all sort of comes together into this Lovecraftian pastiche.
Yes. So I think that's a good place to then get into kind of one of the core themes around your account, which is obviously HP Lovecraft himself. And you call yourself a horrorist, and what you mean by that is actually something very particular. You know, what you're writing is more along the lines of like a sci-fi horror, right? And it's interesting to me because the kinds of horrors you confront in your writing that's sort of influenced by this accelerationist paradigm are these very impersonal and almost uncanny like machinations, right? That are sort of beyond us or almost godlike to us. This is, you know, you can see sort of the Lovecraftian influence there. And it's not like how do you think that the future of sci-fi is limited to these sort of horroristic incantations, or do you or is there some sort of positive vision of the future? And do you think that the former is part of like an effect of our own feelings of alienation and misunderstanding in terms of the situatedness that we feel that we're in relation to these technological tools? One of the things that I was thinking about, I had a conversation the other week with Nina Power on Ivan Illich, who's sort of a left-wing Catholic anarchist, and he has this notion of tools for conviviality, which essentially, I haven't read the book, but essentially the essential idea is basically how do we go from tools you know, using us to us using tools. So it's sort of a backwards looking kind of frame of things. And he was sort of a traditionalist. But what I see in a lot of your writing and in sort of the themes more generally that come out of it is this sort of feeling that it's the technology itself that is kind of taking on this monstrous character and is having an influence over us that is not both not in our control, but also not entirely intelligible to us. Is that how you conceptualize technology and its experience to contemporary people, particularly those who are maybe not as technically inclined, that it's some sort of outside, larger than life entity, and that there are sort of all these kinds of horrors in wait for us behind them?
So I've been thinking about this exact question quite a bit lately, and I sort of zoom in on a particular phrase you said, which was a positive vision. And I'd really like to know the provenance of this phrase, because you hear it all the time from many different people that say it's not enough to criticize, you have to express a positive vision. And so I think many people are looking for a positive vision, and some people will say of someone like me, like that I don't have one, which is probably true. I'm thinking a lot about what no one really knows what a positive vision looks like. And I'm actually writing sort of an essay on this topic quite a bit. I've been influenced quite by Peter Thiel,
Yes.
who talks about this. He points out that really too many people who are fond of technology right now. Overall, he points out how in, like, say, the 60s, there were still these kind of utopian visions of the world being better through technology. Everyone's healthier and happier and more productive. You look at something like the Jetsons, everyone kind of lives in space and everything is super convenient, but for some reason there's no, like, their frictions and their tensions in life are just trivialities. They're sort of the last men. And then obviously the Jetsons is a kid show. They're not going to wrestle with that. There's a sort of a fan canon that says that the Flintstones and the Jetsons are happening at the same time, and the Jetsons are up above, and the Flintstones are down below on Earth, like, and it's actually this dystopian world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really telling. It's the only way we can make sense of something like that now, looking back in 21. Like, there's no way that people are just content with that. There has to be an under and a lower class. There has to be exploitation. There has to be something going on there. But so the really, to go back to your question a little, the sort of key thing we're trying to ask here is, like, is a technological utopia possible in any way? Like, does every technology we make just curl like a monkey's paw? Does it always come back to bite us? And I've been looking for cases, for examples of a technology that hasn't done that. You know, we look at, like, medical technology, things like, okay, penicillin, that seems to be pretty much an unalloyed good. It's really, really hard for me to find a way that penicillin makes the world a dystopia. So that one's probably best. Although you could argue that penicillin has freed up people to behave in very sexually promiscuous ways that maybe they couldn't have prior to that discovery. And maybe it does degrade our social fabric. Maybe just knowing that, you know, if I sleep around, I can go get an injection in my dick and not die of syphilis. Maybe that's a really bad thing for society, even if it's really good for every individual. So there's sort of, I think back then, when a lot of these industrial technologies like plastics and, you know, new medicines and agricultural methods, there's something called the second green revolution, when we figured out how to, like, you know, 100x the food output of a plot of land through fertilizers and pesticides and various other techniques. It's like but that precipitated the obesity epidemic, mm-hmm. right? So every single good advance that we look at and say, all right, we had this amazing achievement, I guess it's progress, we can also point to all these horrible trade-offs. And we can no longer look at at our technological advances without considering their dark trade-offs. And so all I really do is I look at technologies that are emerging now, things that are honestly pretty cool and exciting. Like, Neuralink is an amazing idea in some sense, right? So is augmented reality. So is cryptocurrency. But every single one of those things, we can also look at all of the downsides, and we can project the worst excesses of their downsides. And it makes it really hard to be a techno-optimist in this day and age. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, so I have a few places I could go with that. One of which is this sort of trade-offs, right? I'm glad you mentioned the word trade-offs, because that was exactly the word that I was thinking about using within sort of the design space of these technologies, right? So whenever we make an innovation, right, innovation is often defined very succinctly as sort of doing more with less. And if you take that to be the definition of innovation, well, then all of these technologies would be assumed to ultimately be having a net positive sum effect on, you know, let's say our standard of living. And yet, when you sort of look at all of these negatives that you're talking about here, these sort of let's call them externalities, just to use economic terms, they are, it's unclear. In almost some sense, you use the word progress there, and you use it somewhat hesitantly, because this whole concept that we're talking about almost calls into question the idea of progress itself, right? If all of our technology, we're the Faustian civilization, right? So this is a Faustian theme. If all of our technology is indeed making some sort of pact, let's say with the devil, that always has a corresponding downside, right? As above, so below, then the idea that actual progress is even possible in any real sense is sort of called into question. Really, what you're having is actually like a more like an intensification, or a magnification or a glorification of sort of the state of existence in increasingly polar extremes, right? So, for example, they say that the Gini coefficient for measuring inequality, right, is something that we always have to contend with, because by and large, the more wealthy we become, the more unequal we become, right? And there are various kinds of economic arguments about a rising tide raising all boats, and I think there's some serious truth to that. That being said, there is this problem of the equivalent downside, and what that means for us. I wanted to get into a few of the things you said there about Peter Thiel, because I'm just a huge, I've been following Peter Thiel for a long time myself, and I've always find his thought to be very intriguing, and the fact that he's able to sort of go to war with competing perspectives inside of his own mind, and then present them in a very, I'd say, nuanced way, at least when he's speaking in public, is something that I admire, and that I aspire to, become better at doing myself. And one of the things he says about our sort of view of technology, or views of the future that you alluded to, is that when you posit these two extremes, right, that the future will either be terrible, and the human, like I know a few friends who think that like humans are going to just like destroy the planet, and we need to like do degrowth, and everybody needs to like start their own organic farm and try to like disconnect from the supply chains, right? So there's a sort of that vision of the future, and then there's sort of this alternate vision of the future, which is sort of this techno utopian vision, which is sort of along the lines of like I guess many of the techno visionaries or transhumanist crowd that you see out of places like Silicon Valley or whatnot. And I think one of Thiel's core points about either of those two visions of the future is that they're both sort of a way to kind of lull us to sleep from actually thinking in concrete terms about what the future would actually look like. This question of a positive vision that you noted, and that if we're going to assert that one should put forward a positive vision, or ask them what your positive vision is, like I did earlier in this conversation, then there needs to be then really what we're asking for is we're asking for like a concrete implementation, and that doesn't either go towards some sort of mediated Armageddon, or some sort of utopian transhumanism, because either of those perspectives both sort of freeze us in place, because we're so far away from realizing any of them that in a way they can serve to sort of keep the status quo chugging along. With regard to your accelerationist influences, I know that you were heavily influenced by Nick Land and by Moldbug as well. Do you think that accelerationism is not simply that the idea that I guess the machinations of capital and its sort of lifelike increasing attraction resources, human resources, to itself is not just an inevitability, but it's also something that should be either resisted or encouraged. Is there an element of human agency in your conception of acceleration? I know, sorry, that was a long
I sort of
question.
go back. Yeah. No, I go back and forth on that myself. I think that if the market, which is sort of a bad abstraction, and we shouldn't really just talk about the market. There is no the market, right? There's layers of markets and anti-markets, and there's human agency at every level of the market, and people sort of like vying for advantage, and things that are maybe really good from a strictly market perspective can be unviable for social reasons or for reasons of the ambition of individual actors there. I think that when it comes to like specific technological advances, things like, even something like AWS, like would we have cloud-based infrastructure if it weren't for Jeff Bezos making a very particular decision in sort of the mid-2000s about the way his company would scale and be structured? And I actually think the answer might well be no, because there were other approaches to scaling up. And before Amazon kind of like went through this long and painful process of building out AWS, everyone just built on-premises server clusters, and everyone had their own, on-site staff to manage these things. Sure, we could have gone into a cloud-based direction. Maybe the winds were blowing that way, but I think individual actors at the apex really can have an outsized influence on the direction of technological growth. That said, once a technology is loose, it never goes back in the box. Like if Amazon completely disintegrated and flew off the face of the earth tomorrow, we would still understand how to, like, cloud-based computing paradigms. Those are going nowhere. And now that we have it, anyone who doesn't use it is at a huge competitive disadvantage in almost every way. I could go stack up a bunch of servers in a warehouse somewhere and try to run my own server cluster and do my own hosting. Certainly there's people who do that. But if I start up and I want to, actually solve the business problems that I'm trying to solve, I do not want to solve all of those infrastructure problems. And so you can individually opt out of a technological solution, but as long as there's sort of an equilibrium where people who use it are able to outcompete those who don't, the technology will go on. So is there human agency with regard to accelerationism? I'd say the answer is yes, with some qualifications.
Okay.
The qualifications, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so these questions can always be a little bit too overdetermined. One of the things to think about, though, is this idea of convergence, right? So, would AWS the AWS model have happened anyway? Because in a hypothetical world without a Jeff Bezos leading the charge, because it just sort of makes sense. And if you look at like the search space, right, of possible technologies, well, the ones that are viable in terms of a business model within that search space is smaller than the ones that are possible. And then on top of that, the ones that are discovered within that have to be smaller than the ones that are viable. And then even within the ones that are discovered, it's probably very unlikely that there would only be one or two or three that you could stumble upon that would be, possible, viable, and discovered. There could be many more. And so it is always sort of an open question whether or not what we have is the only thing that could have happened, or if it would have inevitably ended up here regardless. So
yeah,
you're not an explicitly political thinker, at least in your writing. I think there are political implications or political what do I want to say? There are political implications and there are political, I guess there are polemic angles that one could, I guess, political interpretations that one could have based on your writing itself. But of course, you're a fiction writer, and none of your work is explicitly concerned with those issues. But of course, I think anyone that's familiar with your work and who's a little bit aware of kind of the online spaces that you're coming out of knows that there are these sort of accelerationist ties and sort of esoteric references that are built into these things. And so how do you self-conceptualize your own politics? We've talked a little bit about who your influences are. And do you think that there is a problem right now, and I'll just make this about the right, with them not being forward looking enough? It seems to me from my own experiences over the last few years, being around various different dissident spaces, talking to people both on the left and the right, that really there is a lack, and this is why I asked you about the positive vision. There is a lack of conceptualization of what the future should entail, and there is a broad, widespread sense that the options that are on the menu by the current political institutions and parties that we have, particularly here in the United States, are just totally nonsensical for our time. They don't make any sense. They don't resonate really with the generations that are coming up now. They're really an artifact of the mid-century, and it's clear that they're outdated and that they're no longer serving us. But what's not clear is what kind of new paradigms that we're going to be headed into the future. So first, do you have a explicitly, would you say, political orientation that's sort of embedded into your work? And then in addition to that, do you think that the various kinds of dissident spaces that exist online are beginning to sort of congeal around something that could look like a coherent offering for those that are preparing to kind of move into the next phase of, let's say, our political paradigms?
I'll answer your questions in reverse order. Do I see it congealing into like new paradigms in a positive direction? The short answer, unfortunately, is no, because what people, there's always been this tension. Even like, I mean, I remember back in 2013, the original sort of Moldbug fan club developed this whole trichotomy of orientations, which you may or may not have seen. And they described themselves as ethnic nationalists, techno-commercialists, and I always forget what the third one was, but basically they were Christian ones. Because you had like sort of Catholics coming in and going, oh, monarchy, I like that. And then you had these kind of post-libertarians coming in and saying, oh yeah, market solutions to governance, I like that. And then you had the ethnic nationalists who are sort of a dumpster fire. But, and me, the less said about them, the better, unfortunately. But the online right has this really divided sort of set of desires. They want two things that are perfectly contradictory. One, they hate technology on the whole. I mean, they use technology, haha, you're very smart, but they don't like it. They point to the evils. This is something I do in a sense of all the new technologies that come out. Communications technology is used as an instrument of mass control and mass demoralization, and it spreads all these horrible sort of lifestyle hazards, and they sort of hate sort of advances, with a few exceptions for things like space travel, which I won't put to shit on. And on the other hand, they want to live in a society where people are sort of smart and free and able to pursue like their own best perception of their interests. And what would happen if people live their life in that way is they would invent things they would create new technologies. That's sort of one sign of flourishing, is that you have ingenuity and you invent. And they will simultaneously hold up the history, like the greatest figures of history as they see it, as people like who are inventors and thinkers and innovators. And, you know, we want to be in a society like that. And we also hate all the new technology that's coming out. And so you can't possibly reconcile these two visions. You can't live in wholly traditional ways while also constantly wanting to bring new technological development to the world. So if they are to congeal, it's not going to happen in this sort of morass of these two conflicting desires. As much as a synthesis of contradictions is often the way forward, it's going to take someone of a very singular character, really a leader, someone who does have a vision. And I'm going to say, I don't think that person is me as much as I'd like it to be, to sort of articulate that synthesis and drive them forward. But if you were to just take what we have now, there's no great showing point, and there's no single person who can really say what that vision would be. To go to your first question, I think I was actually doing some research on this myself. There is, I think you were referring to Thiel, where there's sort of these two doors of like the eco-future, where we all just kind of break away and go off grid. And then there's like this sort of techno-communist future where everything is just a total technological panopticon. And it's basically, you end up with the Borg from Star Trek, which is a point that I couldn't help but raise in exactly that way in my latest story. The thing is, both of these can exist simultaneously. And what will happen is that the techno-capitalist society and the eco-minimalist society can just coexist in the same space and really hardly even bother each other at all. They don't care. One of them is going to the stars, you know, through effort with aspiration, and the other one is just sort of earthbound. I think it's like a phase shift. When water freezes, there's still liquid water around a lot of the time. When it evaporates, there's still liquid water. So you're talking about different phases of society. They can exist in simultaneity. There's not one future, there's many.
Yeah, so you're recalling to my mind the vision of the Flintstones and the Jetsons again. We're gonna end up with that.
Yes,
that's what I'm imagining. My friends,
which way, Western man?
Yeah, on their organic homesteads, who, you know, are using like literally hand plows to till their fields. Meanwhile, you know, Bezos and his buddies are taking trips to Mars for the holiday. Well, so I would agree with you there that I don't think those two visions need to necessarily interfere with one another. But I would say that I think the more you know, eco-conscious degrowth people, you know, whatever you want to call them, are at a supreme disadvantage in terms of their war-making capacity, in that sense, in that all the tools of industry and high technology that would be required to you know, defend themselves or to build weapon systems or anything along those lines would of course be in the hands of the techno-futurists. And so that is
right. They survive by being too small to matter, not by out competing it on its own terms, right?
Right. And then of course, because they don't have any power, their future isn't really up to them. And that's actually my biggest problem with that vision, is that I just view it as so disempowering to sort of try to, because it's not really an escape. It's more like you're descending into obscurity, right? And because you don't affect anything else that matters, you get the choice to live how you would like. And of course, that is always contingent on someone else leaving you alone. And so that's my issue with it, is that as soon as someone decides not to leave you alone, then you're kind of screwed. So where do I want to go next? So I want to talk to you a little bit about your latest piece. because your latest piece was what actually inspired me to go ahead and invite you on the show, which is called Don't Make Me Think. And you did some really interesting, it follows along some of the themes that exist in your other writings and that we've been talking about here. This issue of transhumanism, this issue of technology, and in particular, what you just said there about kind of like an enclosed world, right, in which everything is sort of measured and tracked, and yet there are always going to be these sort of existing little pockets where various kinds of dissent or piracy or sort of marginal, and I mean that in the real term, marginal communities will sort of exist within this sort of omnipresent lattice of networks. So do you want to just briefly give an overview for those who aren't acquainted with it yet of Don't Make Me Think? And then I have some questions for you about kind of the stylistic choices that you made in the piece.
Yes, there are some questions there. Yeah, I'll give an overview. So the story is actually a retelling of a short by Borges called The Dead Man. And in this story, there's sort of a young man who joins a gang, like a mafia, and is led by a famous gangster. And this boy, he covets the authority and the power of the gangster. So he betrays him and tries to unseat him and take his power. But the gangster makes a mockery of him. He humiliates him. He lets him think he's running the show for a little bit, and then he kills him in front of everyone. And I really, my biggest influence as a fiction writer is certainly Borges. But I wanted to bring that story into this world of Neuralink enhanced people who have the brain implant that Elon Musk's Neuralink Corporation is developing. And if you've seen the demos, it's really a remarkable thing. I think it's the most interesting of all of Elon's different companies, but also somehow the one that gets the least amount of press attention. He's got robots that perform neurosurgery and stick all these little fibers in your brain. And then through Bluetooth, the device streams these metrics out, and they can predict exactly where all your joints are in your body. You can move a cursor. You can use it as an input device to control your computer. They have demos of monkeys. Like, they train the thing in minutes to understand what the monkey's doing with a joystick. Then they disconnect the joystick, and the monkey can drive the program with its brain. This is incredible. And if this ever caught on in the way that smartphones did, it would change the world in a lot of really interesting and really horrifying ways. So in my story, I wanted to try to bring that to life.
Yes, and on the point about Neuralink, what's happening there is basically they're decoding the electrical signals that are attached to sort of the motor movements of the monkey, and essentially just reversing the order in which those are read out in order to match them to the actual movements. And of course, the implications for what other kinds of things you could do with that in terms of thought, in terms of even feeding back, and maybe even controlling the monkey himself, are ghastly, to say the least. So I want to ask you particularly about the emoticons, because I know you're getting a lot of different kinds of feedback on that, and it was an interesting choice, I think, for you to make to include those. And I think when I sent you the message to invite you on the show, I wanted to bring it up because it's something that I think can easily be thought of as kind of a gimmick or almost like a kitsch thing to do, when in fact it doesn't strike me as being that at all. So for those of you who maybe haven't gone and found the piece yet, I'll just say that throughout this entire piece, Zero HP basically comes up with this whole lexicon of emoji characters, which are inserted along with the text at various points. I'll let him tell you a little bit about the intent, but the effect of which is to sort of bring up kind of visual associations for someone that is reading this, along with the actual reading of the words themselves. And this has certain, I would say, neurological functions. But I will let Zero himself explain his choice to include those right now.
Yeah, so I knew it would be controversial when I did it, and a lot of people would just hate it or complain or refuse to read it. I was fully aware of that. And my sort of response to those people is that, well, it's not for you then. And that's just a fact. It's not like, I think people process it very different ways. I was really interested to read the conversation on the Slate Star Codex Reddit where they were discussing it. You know, some people have a huge problem with it. They say, oh, it disrupts my flow. I can't read this. Someone said it nauseated them. Others said, oh, you know, I got used to it. It enhanced it. It added this other layer. I think it was a successful device, but the basic idea, and by the way, it took me over a month to annotate the entire text by hand with emoji. I spent actually quite a long time on this. And I tried to make sure that the grammar and the lexicon was as fully consistent as I possibly could. But what I wanted to do was split out the sensory modality of reading and kind of intentionally break your brain a little bit, because you're used to reading just words. We have like, you know, a memory for that. Like, it's something that becomes very second nature to us. But by adding this layer of symbols, it sort of breaks it out and forces you to read differently. And it takes effort. I'm not going to lie. To focus on this text and to read it end to end, it is mentally taxing in a way that regular characters are not, which is one of the meanings of the title, Don't Make Me Think. It's also the name of a famous book on usability that's popular among like web designers. But it's sort of a joke, because in order to read this, I am making you think in a way that you're almost certainly not used to thinking, which is in this pictographic, ideographic way. And the hope is that for the characters in the story with their Neuralink implant, when they are doing anything, there is enhancement in their brain. I kind of allude to this a little bit, where people feel extra emotions when they play video games, when they are driving a car, or just like going through their day, they do their homework, they turn in an assignment at work, whatever it is. You know, the Neuralink device in my story rewards them with extra enhancements in terms of sensory perceptions and feelings and so on. So they are not living inside of their own heads. They're not having cognition the way you and I experiencing it. They're having this sort of juiced, that's what they call it. I don't know if you know this, there's a rumor that I was one of the main developers of Candy Crush. I will neither confirm nor deny that, but I will say that in the sort of freemium mobile space, when they add all these little sparkles and bounces and sound effects to the loot boxes when they open, or the you know, power-ups, whatever it is, they refer to that as juicing it. They say they make it juicy, and it gives you this layer of satisfaction that is also addictive. So I wanted to try to do something to this text to give you a feeling like you yourself are going through that. What if every time you hear a word, you also see a picture associated with that word? What if I can bring up extra emotions and extra feelings as you read the text? It doesn't feel like reading the way you're used to it, but it does feel like something that I hope is novel.
So my understanding of working memory is that our language processing and our visual processing are on two separate tracks, roughly. And of course, there's crosstalk and all of that. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about the piece is that you're actually utilizing two different modalities of thinking by if the reader decides to engage with it in that way, that is interpreting both the letters and the emojis. Um, and so maybe people might not realize that actually what's happening is your brain is literally context switching whenever you are trying to process both. And in fact, you're not processing the emoji with the same parts of your cognition that you're processing the words, even though you are reading the words. So that was just an interesting point for me, having known that already about the way that we do things when I was reading the essay. I will be honest with you, Zero. I started off trying to interpret all of the emoji, and like you said, it does take work. So eventually, I think at some point, I just kind of slid into a mode of more or less ignoring them, and that was kind of my way of dealing with it. But it is interesting to me that you wanted to kind of elicit this almost synesthetic uh, experience for the reader, right? That is, if you can evoke not only the words themselves, and I think for those of us who are more verbally fluent, we tend to sort of think a lot in words, but also to get these feelings and these pictures, and maybe even other extrasensory components. You could imagine a more enhanced version of this in which sort of like smells come out or something like that. And of course, there you could even have there's uh, like haptic feedback, right? You could have haptic feedback, in your sitting in your computer chair or your mouse or whatever, which people do with gaming controllers. And all of that could even enhance the experience. You can imagine many different ways in which you could try to sort of transport someone to that place. Do you think about doing
Yeah,
this with like virtual reality at some point?
I will continue to explore new ways to present uh, fictional stories, and I wouldn't rule anything out. But at the moment, I don't have any cool new gimmicks planned. I think it has to happen sort of spontaneously and emergently. One other thing I will say about the emoji is that I had originally intended to sort of have this moment in the story when I flipped a switch and started dropping words and only using symbols. And the idea would be that if you had paid attention to the emoji, then you'd be able to parse the pure symbolic vocabulary and still understand the story without any words. I think that was very ambitious, and I tried it a little bit towards the end. And what I found was that I personally struggled with it, so I knew that it would just be too much to ask for the readers, and I ultimately had to discard it. But
So, oh,
yeah, I think if I use virtual reality, I would.
well, I was going to ask you. I don't know how much feedback you've gotten. You're followed by enough people on Twitter that certainly you have fans, I would say, all over the world. Um, so I wanted to ask you then: do you think that, or have you actually heard anything about uh, non native English speakers, particularly those who come from East Asian alphabets, where the signage is more visually oriented rather than uh, I don't know how you would characterize our alphabets, but sort of linear.
Alphabetic, yeah.
Yeah, alphabetic, sort of the Latin alphabet. Do you think that maybe they, or have you heard anything about them, would be more adept at interpreting the emoji? It might be less work for them, or even come more naturally to kind of go into this visual mode with regard to their reading.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about it, but it is something that intrigues me, and it's something I definitely thought of in the composition of the work. I looked at there is sort of a a Chinese motif throughout the story. I read quite a bit of classic Chinese poetry in translation to write this story, and I tried to borrow some of their poetic ideas and words, like language, There are some short poems which I synthesized out other poems throughout the work as well. So I was very consciously thinking about the Chinese language when I put together the emoji lexicon that I used, but I haven't heard anything from any Chinese speakers or about their experience. No.
Interesting. Well, I wonder if you'll end up getting some feedback on that eventually. I assume at some point someone will come across it and tell you if that's the case. That being said, Zero, I have a few more big questions to ask, and then I will go ahead and let you go here. One of the things that's sort of topical for today that I think we might address is that, and this is getting a little bit into kind of Twitter inside baseball stuff, but Bronze Age Pervert was suspended. I believe that happened today. He's been suspended before. He's had his other accounts banned, but he's banned again. He may not come back this time. That being said, I'm not going to ask you about speculating why, it's clear that maybe there's no reason at all, but are you worried about getting banned, getting removed from these platforms? And how do you think about this issue of, banning, not banning, doxing, et cetera, more generally? I know we talked a little bit about anonymity and pseudonymity in the beginning. As someone who is sort of operating, at least on the podcast level and more or less on Twitter, under my own name, I am obviously willing to adopt a certain amount of risk in associating my online activities with my real self, partly just because I'm just really stubborn, and also partly because I'm probably a little crazy. That being said, do you worry about getting banned yourself because of various associations that you might be involved in? Do you think that the online space of Twitter is sort of becoming a place where unoriginal thought, where original thought is becoming increasingly impossible? Or are these sort of bannings just kind of par for the course in terms of, regularly the regime kind of just throws a switch and just decides that someone needs to disappear or have their presence downregulated?
I thought has been difficult in every age, and it has always been, and it's not as dangerous now in the U.S. as it has been in other places and times, though there are many indicators that it is becoming so, or that it will become so. If I get banned Twitter, I have some backup platforms. It probably would take some of the wind out of my sails, but I also think that I can't really stop myself from writing. It's just something I want to do, something I have to do. And I will continue to exist in other venues, I hope, until maybe I get hounded off of those venues as well. We will see. Future's uncertain, but BAP has already respawned on Telegram. He had a BAP on Telegram. As of this month, he has 7,600 subscribers. So I think his book exists. There's physical copies of it all over. People buy it as gifts and give it around. So I think he's going to endure in some form. I hope that I will as well. But yeah, every morning I sort of go through my morning routine, and when I log on, I always sort of have this question of does my account still exist? I don't know. You just have to take it one day at a time in that sense.
And for the normies listening, or for those of us who do go under our own identities, do you have any advice for what we might do to avoid our inevitable cancellation? One of the things I joke about with this podcast is well, the best thing for my business that could possibly happen is me getting canceled, because I know so many people who were operating just going along normally, and then they got canceled. And then after they got canceled, they came back way bigger than they were before, or they at least were able to rally a bunch of support that they weren't previously getting. Now, I'm not wishing that on myself. It's an extremely stressful and potentially, fraught with danger process to be going through. And so I don't think that cancellation is necessarily good for you. But it is always sort of in the back of my mind, like, at what point am I going to say the wrong thing or become big enough or create enough of a stir that that someone is going to come after me? So far, nobody that I know of has, even attempted to bother with it, partly because I take some prudent measures in terms of what I'm willing to say online and in public, but partly also because I'm just not that relevant at this point. So do you think that there is a way to continue operating for those of us who are doing so under our own names, or do you think that eventually everyone will sort of have to retreat into various shades of anonymity?
No, they can't cancel everyone. And also, there are degrees of cancellation, right? Like, if you get canceled in the sense of you get fired from your job and you're a journalist or a person who works in media in any way, then they say, oh, cancellation doesn't hurt you. And they're sort of right, because infamy can drive, your popularity. But the real cancellation, which is sort of a degree beyond that, is when your bank accounts get down, you get put on no-fly list. Look at Alex Jones.
Right.
This is a man who was like, he didn't get canceled and come back. He just got deleted. There are other, even less savory elements on the internet. People who were kicked off of their ISP, people who were kicked off of Cloudflare, which is, for those who don't know, a web service that basically allows you to serve your site to a large audience, even when you're at the risk of getting attacked by like denial of source attacks and things like that. Basically, it prevents you from getting overloaded by like a popularity attack, if you don't understand these things. Anyway, so there's a degree of cancellation which can be really, which I would almost call fake cancellation. Like, okay, you got fired from your job at like an imperial news organ. That's a type of cancellation. That probably hurts. I'm sure it sucks. But then there's like the kind where, you can no longer use PayPal and Patreon, and your credit cards stop working. You get locked out of your bank accounts and you can't book a flight. That's the type of cancellation that I'd be worried about. But again, they can't do it to everyone. They can't do it to 80 million Trump supporters, for example. If you do that, you don't have a cancellation, you have an insurrection. So it works best as kind of a campaign of terror, where you never know who it's going to strike. It could be someone big, it could be someone small, but it's always just a tiny minority. And sort of the fear of the lash keeps the majority in check. So you probably don't have to worry, as long as you mostly stick to the Overton window, is what I would say.
Yeah, I believe that to be true. And I think also that anyone that is seriously worried about it, I think, well, for one, I would say that as the consequences of speaking out against wherever the Overton window is at that day, become more severe, people are going to begin to take more precautions, right? In terms of having backups, in terms of, even compartmentalizing their financial lives, moving more into cryptocurrencies and things along those lines. I know Alex Jones is still operating. I'm sure he's still making millions a year running InfoWars. And he did get his bank accounts closed and all that stuff. But, really, they haven't totally destroyed the man. And of course, he had a large enough and well-established enough entity already that even with all of the pressure that was put on him, he was able to sort of still basically, float away and now he's relegated to whatever corner of the internet they allow him to be on. That being said, yeah, the financial cancellation, like sort of the denial of service, and I don't mean DDoS as hacks. I mean denial of service in that Bank of America sends you a letter and says you can't transact with us anymore, and by the way, we're going to seize whatever's left in your account. That is extremely scary for most people who are not extraordinarily wealthy, and so yeah. I don't know exactly what the future of that is going to look like, but you're right that they can't do it to tens of millions of people, because at that point you just have a whole, you're essentially just declaring a large chunk of the population to be second-class citizens or enemies of the state even, and which and I've talked about on here already, the new war on terror is coming for us all, and it's being aimed at us, which is fun. But anyway, Zero, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. Last thing before I go, what can people expect to see from you in the future? What have you been working on? What are your thoughts about the future of Zero HP Lovecraft?
Well, my next project is a physical book, which I'm working with Canonic.xyz. It's a limited edition, leather-bound, hardback, very high-quality printing. We're only going to make about 200 of them. 200 wow. of them. They're going to add. So that's going to be an anthology of all of the stories I have written to date, plus some notes and introductions and sorted thoughts that go along with it. So I'm really excited for that. I think it's a really unusual project. Most people go with like the Amazon print-on-demand paperback. Nothing wrong with that, and I may look into that at a later date, sort of after the limited edition has had its chance to kind of be disseminated and run its course. So that's my next immediate goal. Other than that, I'm going to be working on more essays for my Substack, probably get back into tweeting threads as opposed to just sort of like off shit posts. And I'll go wherever the muse takes me.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And I also think that that strategy of like intentional or strategic scarcity is supremely undervalued, particularly when you're talking about rare items that people are producing. Maybe we'll see a Zero HP NFT at some point. Anyway,
yes,
well,
so the book will be sold as an NFT.
Oh, okay, awesome.
That's how it works.
Right.
Yeah, so you buy the way it works is you buy the NFT, and then you can redeem the NFT exactly one time for a physical copy of the book.
Yeah, and then that's only going to be 200, so it will eventually become a rare artifact.
Yes.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This is a blast, and I'll see you on Twitter.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.